Good morning and welcome to the May 2nd meeting of the Rules Committee. We have, I believe, one bill coming forward, and I believe the prime sponsor is Representative Porcelli. Did I pronounce that correct? If you would like to come forward, that would be terrific. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for letting me testify this morning on this nice rainy morning. HB 269, as amended, is an act relative to limiting the authority of New Hampshire delegates to policymaking conventions. I'm Representative Susan Porcelli, Rockingham, District 19, Hampton Falls and Kensington. I'm here today to present HB 269 as amended, an act relative to limiting the authority of New Hampshire delegates to policymaking conventions. This bill, also known as the Faithful Delegate Law, is common sense legislation to propose controls, guidelines, and guardrails to limit the authority of New Hampshire delegates to any interstate policymaking convention. The purpose of this bill is to ensure that the New Hampshire legislature defines the scope and sets limitations on the role and authority of delegates representing the sovereignty of New Hampshire. A previous version of this bill, HB 148, passed both the House and the Senate in 2015. Governor Hassan then vetoed the bill because she determined it was not required at the time. Also note that in 2020, Supreme Court decision Chiafalo versus Washington, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled 9-0 that state legislatures maintain control over their appointed delegates. This bill has three main components to ensure the limitations of this authority is followed. Number one, it establishes a procedure for the selection of delegates. Number two, it limits the authority of delegates to only those granted by the New Hampshire state legislature. And number three, it creates a procedure for recalling and replacing delegates who act outside the scope and the authority granted to them by the New Hampshire legislature. The bill seeks to protect New Hampshire sovereignty by defining specific processes and procedures. The bill adds definitions such as delegate, interstate convention, and permitted scope. So a delegate is a person defined from the state of New Hampshire, selected by the legislature to represent the people and state of New Hampshire at any interstate convention. An interstate convention is a multi-state gathering or virtual workshop for the purpose of coordinating or proposing new written policy or amendments to existing rules or laws. Amendment 2023-0330H excludes the Uniform Law Commission from this bill. ISO New England is an important interstate convention that reviews electric policy for New Hampshire and surrounding states. Another example is commonly known as Article 5 Convention of States. Permitted scope outlines and defines the specific topics that can be addressed by these conventions as directed by the New Hampshire legislature. Detailed processes and procedures for the selection of delegates are also described in this bill. The New Hampshire General Court selects delegates as outlined. 4 delegates selected from the House, 3 delegates selected from the Senate, and there is a process to select alternate delegates in the bill. Under this bill, the authority of delegates is clearly and precisely detailed. As stated, delegates from New Hampshire to an interstate convention shall not have the authority to allow or support an unauthorized amendment. In addition, any vote taken by a delegate in violation of this authority shall be disqualified and reported to the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State shall take immediate action to revoke the credentialing of the delegate in question and appoint an alternate. Every delegate from New Hampshire to an interstate convention shall be required to take an oath affirming these limitations on their authority. The Secretary of State is required to certify the selection of the New Hampshire delegates as discussed. And the Secretary of State shall be responsible for enforcing these policies. There is a fiscal note on this bill, so Amendment 2023-0752H states that each delegate shall be reimbursed for actual expenses submitted, including but not limited to transportation, lodging, and meals. These interstate conventions have been curtailed over the past 2 years, and anticipated expenditures are indeterminable at this time. In conclusion, I urge the passage of this bill to provide common sense legislation to propose guidelines, controls, and guardrails to select delegates, limit the authority of New Hampshire delegates to any policy-making interstate convention, and provide a clear procedure for recalling and replacing delegates that act outside the scope of authority as granted by the New Hampshire legislature. Thank you for allowing me to testify.
Thank you very much for your testimony this morning. Are there any questions from the committee? I have a question. We have 7 members, if this was to pass, that would come from New Hampshire. How did you arrive at the number 7? Was it based on population or just
It was based on past precedent.
past precedent? Okay. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, the chair will call Dan McGuire. Good morning, Representative.
How are you, Madam Chair? Thank you. Thank you to members of the committee. For the record, my name is Dan McGuire. I represent the town of Epsom. This bill came to my committee, the Finance Committee, as a second committee, and we did amend it. And so I was required to, I had to argue this on the floor, and it was somewhat of a close vote. So I thought I could just answer any questions you might have. This is a really minor bill in the sense that it's completely prospective. It sets up a procedure for something that we don't yet need right now. You know what I mean? So if a circumstance comes up where such a convention would be formed, we'll have a procedure in place to deal with it, rather than having to wait to pass such a bill at the time. So it's reasonable, but it's not, I wouldn't call it urgent or something like that. The bill as it originally came to us had a per diem payment to the delegates, and we took that out in our amendment because the legislature has a history of getting in trouble with per diem payments. So we didn't feel it was appropriate given the fact that we're volunteers and so on. So it still has in it expense money, so hotel, transportation, et cetera, the meals, those kind of expenses, but that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your testimony, Representative. Are there any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you. The chair will call Samuel Feldman. Good morning, Mr. Feldman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Samuel Fieldman with Wolfpack. This bill, as Representative Porcelli described, is broadly dealing with all of the different types of conventions that could meet. One that I study in particular and work quite a bit with is the Article 5 Proposing Convention. There's a separate bill, HB 392, that I testified for Senator Perkins Kwaka and her committee. previously about that is related to this. And I just want to make sure that you understand the Article 5 convention process and how these two bills work either separately or together. They are not in conflict with each other in order to make that process stronger. In the convention process, if 34 states, 2/3 of the states, call for a convention limited to a certain subject, then a convention meets of all 50 states where they all send delegates to propose an amendment limited to that specific subject. That then goes, Congress then sends that amendment on to the states, just as if Congress had proposed the amendment, where it then gets ratified by 3/4 of the states, either through state conventions or through state legislatures, whichever path Congress chooses, the same as if Congress had proposed an amendment. Congress has proposed the path of using conventions to ratify an amendment once, and we saw at that time it worked very well, but states were caught a little bit off guard, and they had to scramble to propose legislation to make that possible and to make that go as smoothly as it did. And the legislation that the states came up with at that time worked very well, but only one of the states at that time had the gold standard legislation with clauses that are in both of the bills, both HB 392 as well as the bill before you today, HB 269. And that gold standard language is to recall and replace any delegates and invalidate their votes should they vote in a way that's contradictory to how they're instructed. That language was adopted later for use in the Electoral College, where in 2020 it was unanimously affirmed to be effective before the Supreme Court. And that's why all of the bills that have been proposed for this kind of purpose around the country have included some version of that kind of language, which is really the gold standard. Now, I can't tell you if or when an Article 5 convention to propose amendments will take place. There is reason to believe that one might happen relatively soon, and that's true whether you support or oppose that process for any particular policy or not. The prudent thing, whether you support or oppose any particular policy, is to be ready for it. The convention process has numerous protections because of the various roles that the courts, the Congress, the states, and the delegates all play in that process. What these two bills do is strengthen the process that the states play in regulating the delegates. The difference between the two bills, this one is broader and applies to all types of conventions, not only the Article 5 convention, and it calls for appointed delegates. The other bill, HB 392, is narrower, applying only to Article 5 proposing conventions, as well as Article 5 ratifying conventions, and that one calls for election of delegates. This bill was amended in the House to ensure that if both bills pass, the elections would supersede, but solely on that one issue of Article 5 proposing conventions. It would not mean that elections would be required for any other of the many types of interstate conventions that this bill covers. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you very much for your testimony this morning. Are there any questions from the committee? Okay, seeing none, thank you very much for your
Thank you.
testimony. Are there any other member of the public who would like to speak to House Bill 269? Okay, seeing none, we'll close the public hearing. Thank you all for being here this morning.